Fix it. If it flies again, I'll kiss you in front of everyone." That was the moment the entire executive helipad fell silent. Victoria Hale stood at the center of the private aviation platform, her arms crossed, a half-smile sharp enough to cut through the morning glare. Behind her, the corporate helicopter sat grounded, its rotor still, its silence louder than the crowd of engineers and executives gathered in anticipation. She had built Hale Dynamics from nothing into a $70 million logistics empire, and she had never been wrong about people, or at least that was what she believed. Today, she had decided to make a point. Her gaze drifted toward the janitor at the edge of the platform. Ethan Walker, gray uniform, worn gloves, eyes lowered as if he had already accepted that the world rarely asked for his opinion. Someone in the crowd chuckled under their breath. Another whispered that this was a waste of time, that men like him fixed floors, not aircraft. Victoria tilted her head slightly, as if studying an interesting experiment. "Well," she said lightly, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you're done being shy, show us what you can do." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the rag in his hand, folded it once, then placed it carefully on the maintenance cart, as if time itself required order. His daughter's drawing, tucked in his pocket, pressed gently against his chest, a reminder of why he kept choosing quiet days over loud pasts. The helicopter loomed above them like a locked question no one wanted to solve. Engineers had already failed twice this morning, and the contract on the line was worth nearly $12 million, enough to shift the company's entire quarter. Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking against the metal floor. "Don't worry," she added with a faint laugh. "This is just for fun. If you fix it, I might even keep my promise." The crowd reacted instantly, a ripple of amusement moving across polished suits and branded uniforms. Ethan finally lifted his gaze, not to her eyes, but to the machine. He studied it the way others studied silence, patiently, without ego, without performance. The wind shifted slightly across the platform, carrying the distant hum of the city below. In that moment, nothing moved except his attention. He stepped forward slowly, crossing the line between observer and something no one in the room had prepared for. Every sound around him seemed to fade, as if the platform itself was holding its breath, watching a man no one had bothered to notice become the only presence that mattered in a space built for importance. While Victoria's confidence, once effortless and sharp, began to feel unfamiliar even to her own thoughts as she realized she was no longer evaluating him, but instead measuring the distance between what she believed and what she was about to understand for the first time without the comfort of certainty that she had always relied on before. The hum of the city far below seemed distant, almost irrelevant, as Ethan Walker stepped closer to the grounded helicopter, his presence quiet but increasingly undeniable. Around him, the engineers shifted their weight, exchanging brief glances that carried more doubt than expectation. Victoria Hale remained near the center of the platform, her expression composed, yet her eyes followed every movement he made with a curiosity she would not yet admit. She checked her watch, a subtle reminder that time here had value measured in contracts and reputation. "You have exactly 10 minutes before we bring in the external team," she said, her tone light but firm, as if granting permission rather than issuing pressure. Ethan did not respond. He circled the aircraft slowly, his gaze moving along the structure in a way that felt less like inspection and more like understanding a language others had forgotten how to speak. He paused near the rotor assembly, tilted his head slightly, and placed 2 fingers lightly against a panel seam. It was not dramatic, not performative, only precise. One of the engineers, a younger man with a tablet in hand, muttered that the diagnostics had already ruled out a control malfunction. Another added that hydraulic readings were stable across all systems. Victoria overheard but did not intervene. Instead, she leaned against a nearby support beam, arms folded, watching as if observing a demonstration she had not yet agreed to believe in. Ethan finally opened a maintenance access panel with careful ease, revealing a compact network of components beneath. The morning light reflected faintly off metallic surfaces, highlighting dust patterns and alignment marks most people would ignore. He did not rush. His movements carried a rhythm that did not belong to hesitation, but to certainty formed over years of repetition that no one here had witnessed. For a moment, he closed his eyes, as if listening rather than looking. Then he adjusted a small connector, tested a linkage with minimal pressure, and paused again. Victoria pushed herself off the beam slightly. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice now more neutral than mocking. Ethan still did not look at her. "Nothing is wrong," he replied calmly, his voice steady and unremarkable, yet it drew attention in a way louder statements had failed to do. He reached deeper into the assembly, checked a calibration point, and gently reseated a component with deliberate care. The engineers exchanged another round of uncertain looks, their confidence in the diagnostics beginning to fracture without any obvious reason. Victoria stepped closer now, her heels echoing softly against the platform, her earlier amusement replaced with a quiet focus she did not intend to reveal. "You are not even using the diagnostic tablet," she noted, half question, half observation. Ethan finally glanced at it, then back at the machine. "It already told you what it thinks," he said simply. "I am listening to what it is not telling you." The sentence lingered in the air longer than expected, unsettling in its simplicity. A faint breeze passed over the platform, carrying the sound of distant traffic and the faint metallic creak of the aircraft frame adjusting under shifting temperature. Victoria's expression tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in the uncomfortable awareness that she no longer fully controlled the narrative unfolding in front of her. Ethan adjusted one final connector, then stepped back half a pace, his eyes scanning the entire structure once more as if confirming a conclusion already reached long. Before anyone else had arrived, the silence on the helipad felt heavier now, not because anything had changed loudly, but because something unspoken was beginning to shift in the way people looked at Ethan Walker. He stood a few steps away from the open maintenance panel, his hands relaxed at his sides, as if he had already finished the work without needing approval. The engineers gathered behind Victoria Hale exchanged quieter observations, their earlier confidence replaced with uncertainty they were trying to hide behind technical jargon. Victoria narrowed her eyes slightly, her focus locked on Ethan rather than the machine, as if she was attempting to find the moment where his confidence might break. "You have not even checked the full diagnostic log," she said, her tone measured, carefully controlled. Ethan did not turn immediately. Instead, he looked at the helicopter as a whole, not the parts, not the systems, but the relationship between them, as if the machine was not broken but simply out of alignment with itself. "The log is not wrong," he said after a moment, his voice calm and steady. "It is just incomplete." One of the engineers shifted uncomfortably, stepping closer to the tablet in his hand. "Incomplete is not a valid conclusion," he said quickly, almost defensively. Ethan finally glanced at him, not with challenge, but with quiet acknowledgment. "It is when the system is being read in isolation," he replied. Victoria pushed off the support beam again, her heels echoing softly as she approached the helicopter with more intent than before. She looked into the open panel, scanning the components Ethan had touched. Everything appeared unchanged at first glance, yet something about the alignment felt different, less chaotic than before. She gestured toward the rotor system above. "If there is an issue here, the sensors should have flagged it," she said. Ethan nodded slightly. "They did," he replied. "They just flagged too many things at once, so the real issue got buried in noise." A subtle tension spread through the group, not from danger, but from realization. Victoria frowned faintly, her mind working through possibilities faster now, recalculating her earlier confidence. "And you believe you found the real issue?" she asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. He reached into the panel once more, adjusted a small alignment node with careful precision, and then stepped back again. "I did not find it," he said quietly. "I removed what was distracting from it." The words lingered, and for the first time, no one laughed or dismissed them. One of the senior engineers leaned closer to the exposed system, scanning it again with renewed attention. His expression changed slowly, as if noticing a pattern he had overlooked a dozen times before. "That coupling," he said under his breath, pointing slightly. "That was not on the primary diagnostic report." Victoria followed his gaze, her posture tightening subtly as she recognized the implication. Ethan finally turned toward the group, his presence still quiet, but no longer invisible. "It would not be," he said, "because it does not fail in isolation. It fails under synchronization load, and only under very specific conditions." The engineers went silent again, this time not out of doubt, but out of recalibration. Victoria looked at Ethan more directly now, her earlier confidence replaced with something more complex, something closer to reluctant attention. She studied him as if trying to place where someone like him would have learned to see what her entire team had missed. The wind moved across the platform again, but this time no one reacted to it. All attention remained fixed on the space between Ethan Walker and the machine, where understanding had begun to replace assumption without asking permission from anyone present. The atmosphere on the helipad had shifted again, not outwardly, but in the way attention now clustered around Ethan Walker, as if he had become the center of a problem no one fully understood yet. Victoria Hale stood closer than before, her arms no longer folded, her posture subtly less performative, as though she was unconsciously preparing herself for information she had not planned to respect. The engineers around her were no longer speaking in confident bursts. Instead, they were quietly cross-checking readings, re-examining assumptions, and glancing at Ethan with a growing hesitation that bordered on unease. Ethan remained still for a moment, his eyes scanning the helicopter again, not in parts, but in flow, as if listening to a conversation beneath the metal surface. Then he stepped forward and pointed gently toward a secondary control line near the rear stabilizer. "The issue is not in the primary system," he said calmly. "It is in the feedback delay between the stabilization module and the pressure regulator." One of the engineers immediately shook his head. "That is within tolerance limits," he said, almost reflexively, as if defending the integrity of his training. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "Within standard tolerance, yes," he replied, "but not within real operational variance at altitude above 5,000 feet, with uneven load distribution." The sentence landed differently this time. It was no longer abstract. It was specific, measurable, and inconveniently precise. Victoria stepped closer to the edge of the open panel, her gaze narrowing as she processed what he had just said. "You are suggesting this only fails under real flight conditions," she said slowly. Ethan looked up briefly. "I am saying it already did," he replied. A quiet pause followed. One of the technicians instinctively checked the system logs again, scrolling deeper this time, past the summary layer, into raw data streams that had been previously dismissed as insignificant fluctuation. His expression changed subtly. "There are micro-oscillations here," he said under his breath. "They were averaged out in the report." Victoria turned her head toward him immediately. "Averaged out," she repeated. The technician hesitated. "Yes." The system flagged them as non-critical noise. Ethan stepped slightly to the side, giving them visual access to the alignment he had adjusted earlier. "Noise is only noise when you are not looking for a pattern," he said quietly. The words settled over the group in a way that felt heavier than technical explanation. Victoria's expression tightened, not in anger, but in the discomfort of recalibration. She had built her reputation on reading systems, people, and outcomes faster than anyone in her industry. Yet now she found herself in the unfamiliar position of watching someone else read a situation she had already declared understood. She turned her attention back to Ethan, studying him more directly now, as if trying to reconcile the janitor's uniform with the precision of his judgment. "If what you are saying is correct," she said carefully, "then this aircraft should not have been cleared for operational testing." Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply looked at the helicopter again, then at the open panel, then at the engineers who were now silently rechecking every assumption they had relied on earlier that morning. "It should not have been cleared," he said at last. "But it was built to pass certification thresholds, not to account for real-world variance under sustained load." A long silence followed. It was not empty anymore. It was active, filled with recalculating minds and shifting certainty. Victoria exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering briefly toward the ground before returning to the machine. For the first time since arriving, she did not speak immediately after hearing an answer. Instead, she watched Ethan Walker as if trying to understand how someone could stand so quietly in the middle of a system everyone else had failed to fully see. The tension on the helipad deepened as the engineers continued silently reviewing the data streams, their earlier certainty now replaced by a cautious, almost uncomfortable focus. Victoria Hale stood still for several seconds, her eyes fixed on the helicopter as if it had subtly changed in front of her without physically moving at all. Ethan Walker remained slightly apart from the group, his attention no longer on proving anything, but on confirming what he already understood. The wind swept across the platform again, carrying the faint sound of distant airport operations, yet even that felt secondary to the quiet recalibration happening among the people present. One of the senior engineers finally spoke, his voice more restrained than before. "We need to simulate a full load cycle with environmental variance," he said, glancing toward Victoria as if seeking permission rather than asserting procedure. Victoria did not answer immediately. Her gaze was still locked on Ethan. There was something disruptive about his calm, not because it was loud or commanding, but because it removed her usual leverage of doubt. After a moment, she nodded once. "Run the simulation," she said simply. The team moved quickly, gathering around the portable diagnostic station positioned beside the aircraft. Screens flickered to life, displaying structured models of stress distribution, rotor feedback timing, and hydraulic response under controlled conditions. Ethan did not approach the station. Instead, he remained where he was, observing from a distance that suggested he was already familiar with what they were about to see. As the simulation began, numbers and graphs shifted in real time, initially appearing stable, reinforcing the original assumption of system integrity. Victoria exhaled slightly, as if preparing for confirmation that her initial trust in certification standards had been correct. But then, gradually, the data began to diverge under extended variance conditions. The stabilization feedback loop showed minor desynchronization, not enough to trigger immediate alerts, but enough to accumulate under sustained stress modeling. One of the engineers straightened. "That should not be happening at this threshold," he said quietly. Another leaned in closer, adjusting parameters, running it again with slightly different environmental inputs. The same pattern reappeared, subtle but consistent. Victoria's expression changed slowly as she watched the replication. It was not shock, but recognition of something she had not accounted for in her leadership assumptions. Ethan finally stepped closer, not to interfere, but to observe their correction attempts. "It will always appear stable under short evaluation cycles," he said calmly, "because the system compensates faster than it degrades. But over time, compensation creates drift, and drift becomes failure under sustained pressure." The room fell quieter again, this time with no resistance. The engineers no longer argued against the possibility. They were now working to understand its structure. Victoria turned slightly toward Ethan, her voice lower than before. "How did you see this?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine attempt to understand. Ethan paused, considering the question not in terms of pride, but in terms of relevance. "I have seen systems like this before," he said. "They do not fail where people expect them to fail. They fail where people assume they are safe." The simulation continued running in the background, now clearly illustrating the divergence he had described. Victoria watched it for several seconds without speaking. The helicopter itself, still grounded and silent, now felt different to everyone present. Not because it had changed, but because the understanding of it had. Finally, Victoria took a slow step forward, her voice measured but no longer dismissive. "Prepare a full inspection," she said to her team. Then she looked at Ethan directly, holding his gaze for a brief moment longer than before. "And you are staying until this is resolved?" she added. Ethan gave a small nod, not as agreement to authority, but as acknowledgment of responsibility. The platform, once filled with confidence and amusement, now carried a different weight, one built entirely from the realization that what had been overlooked was never small, only unseen. The inspection process began with a level of intensity that had not existed earlier that morning, as the helicopter was no longer treated as a routine technical issue, but as a system requiring complete reevaluation under controlled conditions. Portable equipment was brought closer to the aircraft, and additional engineers were called from the maintenance hangar, each arriving with increasing awareness that this was no longer a standard troubleshooting scenario. Victoria Hale remained on the helipad, now positioned slightly behind the technical team rather than in front of them, her earlier confidence replaced with a focused silence that suggested she was absorbing more than she was saying. Ethan Walker stood near the open maintenance panel, no longer actively working, but observing the flow of procedures with the calm presence of someone who had already moved several steps ahead in understanding. The lead engineer began a full structural review, requesting sequential verification of all stabilization systems, while another team member cross-referenced historical performance logs from previous flights under similar environmental conditions. The data continued to confirm what Ethan had described, not through dramatic failure, but through consistent micro-deviations that accumulated under sustained simulation. Victoria crossed her arms loosely, her gaze shifting between the diagnostics screen and Ethan, as if trying to reconcile the technical accuracy of his assessment with the absence of formal credentials on record. "We checked certification compliance last quarter," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. One of the engineers responded without looking up. "Certification does not always reflect operational variance under compounded load conditions." The sentence hung in the air longer than expected, and Victoria did not immediately respond. Ethan stepped slightly closer to the diagnostic display, not to take control, but to point subtly at a recurring pattern line that was now becoming more visible as data layers accumulated. "It will continue to appear acceptable in isolation tests," he said calmly. "But when environmental variables overlap, the delay compounds at the synchronization point." The engineer reviewing the logs paused, then slowly zoomed into a deeper layer of system response history. "This is not in the standard reporting interface," he said, almost under his breath. Ethan nodded once. "It would not be," he replied, "because standard interfaces are designed for stability confirmation, not instability prediction." Victoria turned her head slightly at that, her expression tightening not with frustration, but with the realization that she was listening to someone who understood the machine at a level that bypassed the structure she had built her entire operational confidence upon. At that moment, a mobile communication alert sounded from one of the engineer's devices, interrupting the quiet focus. He checked it quickly, then hesitated before speaking. "We just received a query from corporate oversight," he said carefully. "They are asking why a janitorial staff member is actively participating in a restricted diagnostic procedure." The words introduced a subtle shift in atmosphere, not because they were aggressive, but because they reflected an external perception that had not yet caught up to the reality unfolding on the helipad. Victoria did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Ethan again, this time with a more deliberate assessment, as if she was no longer evaluating his knowledge, but evaluating the consequences of it being visible in this environment. Ethan remained unchanged in posture or expression. "It does not matter what title they assign to me," he said calmly. "The system does not respond to titles." The lead engineer exhaled slowly, then returned to the diagnostics with renewed focus. The helicopter, still grounded, now felt less like a machine in question and more like a complex system finally being interpreted correctly for the first time. Victoria stepped slightly forward again, her voice lower, directed toward Ethan rather than the group. "If this continues," she said, "you realize this will become more than a maintenance issue." Ethan met her gaze briefly, not with concern, but with clarity. "It already is more than a maintenance issue," he replied. The wind moved across the platform once more, but no one reacted to it. The attention of every person present remained fixed on the unfolding inspection, where each layer of discovery was no longer about fixing a helicopter, but about redefining what had been overlooked long before anyone had stepped onto the helipad. The helipad was no longer a place of observation, but a controlled environment of investigation, where every movement carried meaning and every silence felt structured by the weight of unfolding truth. The engineers had spread out into a tighter formation around the helicopter, each of them focused on different diagnostic layers, while Victoria Hale remained slightly apart, her attention divided between the data feed and Ethan Walker, who still stood with the same calm stillness that had defined him since the beginning. The earlier skepticism from corporate oversight had not yet escalated, but it lingered in the background through silent messages and delayed confirmations that the situation was now under review. Ethan did not react to any of it. Instead, he focused on the aircraft as the team initiated a deeper system scan, one that bypassed surface-level reporting and accessed raw synchronization behavior under simulated altitude strain. The results began to shift more clearly now. What had once appeared as minor deviations were becoming structured patterns, repeating across multiple test cycles with consistent timing irregularities. One of the senior engineers stepped back slightly from the console, exhaling in a way that suggested reluctant acknowledgment. This is not a random fluctuation, he said. It is a repeating phase offset. Victoria turned toward the screen, her expression tightening as the implication became unavoidable. A phase offset meant systemic misalignment, not failure of a single component, but a breakdown in timing coordination between subsystems that were expected to operate in perfect synchronization. Ethan finally moved closer again, his voice steady as he observed the data progression. It only becomes visible when the system is forced to maintain peak load beyond short duration cycles, he said. That is why it was missed in standard certification testing. The engineer at the console nodded slowly, his fingers still hovering over the interface. It would have passed all regulated test conditions, he said, because none of them simulate continuous operational strain at variable atmospheric feedback. Victoria listened without interrupting, her attention now fully locked on the technical explanation rather than the authority structure around it. For the first time since arriving, she was no longer leading the interpretation of the problem. She was absorbing it. A second engineer pulled up a deeper historical log, comparing prior flight data with current simulation outputs. The alignment discrepancies were subtle, but undeniable when placed side by side. This pattern existed in earlier test flights, he said quietly. It was flagged, but categorized as non-critical drift and archived. That statement changed the atmosphere again. Archiving a known drift pattern meant it had been observed but not prioritized, a decision that now carried different weight in light of Ethan's assessment. Victoria stepped closer to the console, her voice lower than before. Who approved the archival classification? She asked. The engineer hesitated, scanning the system metadata. It traces back to pre-production validation, he said. Multiple layers of sign-off. Ethan watched the data continue to cycle. That is how systems fail without appearing broken, he said. They are validated to meet expectations, not to survive variation. The words settled over the group without resistance now. Even the engineers who had initially questioned his involvement were no longer focused on hierarchy or role definition. They were focused on accuracy. Victoria turned slightly toward Ethan again, her expression now measured, no longer defensive. You did not just identify a fault, she said. You identified a design assumption. Ethan did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone remained unchanged. Assumptions are what systems are built on, he said. They only become visible when reality tests them long enough. A quiet pause followed as the helicopter sat motionless above them, no longer simply a machine requiring repair, but a system whose unseen behavior had been brought into clarity by observation rather than authority. Victoria exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting from the data to Ethan once more, now with a different kind of understanding forming beneath her earlier confidence. For the first time since the inspection began, she was no longer asking what was wrong with the helicopter. She was beginning to understand what had been overlooked long before she ever arrived at the helipad. The inspection reached a deeper phase where the technical team was no longer simply identifying issues, but reconstructing the entire behavioral profile of the helicopter systems under sustained operational stress. The helipad, once filled with fragmented curiosity and occasional skepticism, had now transformed into a unified space of concentrated analysis. Every engineer present was fully engaged, their attention locked on overlapping data streams that continued to confirm the same underlying structural phenomenon Ethan Walker had described from the beginning. Victoria Hale stood slightly behind the main diagnostic station now, her presence quieter, less dominant, as if she had unconsciously stepped out of the center of control and into the position of observer. Her eyes moved between the evolving simulation results and Ethan, who remained calm and unchanged in posture, as though the increasing validation of his assessment was not surprising to him, only expected. One of the engineers adjusted the simulation parameters again, this time extending the operational duration while increasing environmental variability to maximum safe limits. The system response immediately revealed a clearer divergence pattern, showing how stabilization corrections introduced latency into the feedback loop rather than eliminating it. It is not just a synchronization delay, the engineer said slowly, his voice carrying a mixture of focus and disbelief. It is a cumulative correction spiral. The term caused several others to look up from their screens. A cumulative correction spiral meant that each attempt by the system to self-stabilize was actually contributing to long-term drift, gradually moving the system further away from equilibrium rather than restoring it. Victoria's expression changed subtly as she processed the implication. A system designed to correct itself was, under specific conditions, accelerating its own instability. Ethan stepped closer to the console again, his presence still calm, but now clearly integrated into the technical workflow rather than standing outside of it. That is why it remained undetected, he said. Each correction cycle reduced short-term error, which made the system appear increasingly stable during standard evaluation. The lead engineer leaned back slightly, looking at the data with renewed intensity. So every test that showed improvement was actually masking degradation, he said. Ethan nodded once. Under controlled conditions, yes. Under continuous real-world operation, no. Victoria crossed her arms again, but this time. The gesture carried less authority and more contemplation. She was no longer reacting to Ethan's presence as an anomaly. She was integrating his perspective into the reality she was responsible for. If what you are saying is accurate, she said carefully, then this aircraft is not suitable for any extended commercial deployment in its current configuration. Ethan did not hesitate. Not without recalibration of the feedback loop architecture, he said. The engineers began exchanging quieter confirmations, running additional verification models that now aligned consistently with Ethan's assessment. The data was no longer resisting interpretation. It was reinforcing it. A moment of stillness followed, not from confusion, but from the weight of conclusion settling across the team. Victoria slowly stepped closer to the console again, her eyes fixed on the stabilized simulation output. For the first time, she saw the system not as a collection of parts validated by certification, but as a dynamic structure that behaved differently under sustained reality than it did under controlled expectation. She turned slightly toward Ethan. You did not just diagnose a mechanical issue, she said quietly. You identified a systemic design flaw. Ethan looked at the helicopter once more before responding. Most systems are not broken, he said. They are just understood within limits that do not match how they actually behave. The words lingered in the air as the simulation continued to run, now consistently demonstrating the same structural insight. Victoria remained silent for several seconds, her gaze alternating between the data and the man standing beside it. The authority she carried had not disappeared, but it had shifted into a different form, one shaped by recognition rather than assumption. Around them, the engineers continued their work, but the tone had changed completely. There was no longer debate about whether Ethan Walker understood the system. The only remaining question was how much further his understanding extended beyond what they had just discovered. The final stage of the inspection unfolded under a controlled silence that felt heavier than any earlier moment on the helipad, as if the entire team understood that what came next would determine whether their findings remained theoretical or became operational reality. The engineers had completed the last round of diagnostic verification, and the results consistently confirmed the same structural behavior Ethan Walker had identified from the beginning. Victoria Hale stood near the edge of the platform now, no longer positioned as the unquestioned center of command, but still fully engaged in every movement, every adjustment, every confirmation being made by her team. The helicopter remained grounded, its presence now less like a machine waiting for repair and more like a system waiting for redefinition. One of the senior engineers finally spoke with cautious clarity. All recalibration parameters are ready for controlled test initialization, he said, glancing briefly toward Victoria. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. Proceed with the minimum safe cycle, she replied. The team moved efficiently, initiating the recalibrated feedback configuration that had been adjusted according to Ethan Walker's assessment. There was no unnecessary conversation now, only structured action guided by precision and quiet anticipation. Ethan stepped slightly back from the immediate operational area, not withdrawing, but observing as someone whose role had already been fulfilled through understanding rather than instruction. The engine sequence initiated, and the helicopter responded with a stability pattern that immediately reflected the updated calibration. For several seconds, the system remained in controlled equilibrium, then transitioned into sustained operational mode under simulated load. The engineers monitored the output closely, their expressions gradually shifting from cautious expectation to quiet confirmation as the previously identified instability no longer appeared within the recalibrated parameters. Victoria watched the data stream without speaking, her focus unwavering as she observed the system maintain consistency across conditions that had previously produced divergence. A subtle change in her expression suggested not surprise, but recognition of the scale of what had been corrected. "It is holding," one of the engineers finally said, almost as if he needed to hear it spoken aloud to accept it fully. Ethan did not react to the statement. He simply observed the system as it continued to demonstrate stability under conditions that had earlier exposed its structural flaw. The helicopter was no longer behaving unpredictably. It was responding as a properly understood system, aligned with the operational reality it was required to sustain. Victoria slowly stepped forward again, approaching the diagnostic station where the final readings were displayed. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quieter than it had been at any point earlier. "This was not a minor correction," she said. "This was a foundational oversight." No one responded immediately, because no response was required. The data had already confirmed her conclusion. She turned slightly toward Ethan, her gaze no longer evaluating him, but acknowledging the depth of what had occurred. "You did not just fix a helicopter," she said. "You prevented a systemic failure that would not have been visible until it was already in operation." Ethan looked at her briefly, then returned his attention to the stabilized system. "It was already visible," he said calmly. "It was just not being interpreted correctly." The words settled across the group without resistance, carrying the weight of final clarity rather than discovery. Victoria remained silent for several seconds, then gave a single slow nod. It was not the nod of authority, but of understanding. The engineers began securing the system for final operational clearance, their movements now confident and synchronized, reflecting a return to procedural stability grounded in corrected knowledge. The helicopter, once uncertain in its behavior, now rested in complete operational readiness under its recalibrated structure. As the team completed their final checks, Victoria remained where she was, watching Ethan Walker with a perspective that had fully shifted from evaluation to recognition. For the first time since the beginning of the day, there was no distance between assumption and reality in her understanding. There was only clarity, and the quiet acknowledgement that what had been overlooked had never been invisible, only unrecognized until someone chose to truly see it.